By reading the news headline, political scientists, should we say within the international community, more people start to believe that sitting US President Donald Trump actually has no plan for the Iranian people after what happened to the nation. At this moment, again, some more experts believe that recent Trump's attack on Iran is rather reckless. What do we understand the complication, and what about the hopes for the country? The most critical question we need to understand is why now? Why is the coalition of US and Israel at this moment? What is the goal intention? And better question, hopefully we can get the answer from our distinguished speaker today. Is Donald Trump one step closer to receive the Nobel Peace Prize? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Jamsheed Choksy. Professor Choksy is a distinguished professor. He is a former chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and the Cultures, former chair of the Department of Central Eurasia Studies, and the current director of the Inter-Asia and Uralic National Resources Center at Indiana University at Bloomington. Well, Professor Choksy, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Professor Choksy, let's answer the question from your perspective. Is sitting U.S. President Donald Trump one step closer to receive the Nobel Peace Prize after what happened to the nation of Iran? And also, do you personally believe that Trump has no plan for the Iranian people after taking out the head of the government?
Is President Trump closer to receiving the Nobel Prize? The simple answer is unclear, because the ultimate path forward in Iran is not in his hands. He has eliminated the supreme leader, who is the second supreme leader, and for the last 47 years, Iran has been run by two clerics who have been essentially dictators. And so by removing the second cleric, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, what Trump has done is he has given the Iranian people an opportunity to determine their own destiny without the heavy hand of the supreme leader. However, it's far from done. Much of the theocracy and the bureaucracy that supported the late Ayatollah is still in place. The question remains, what happens to those individuals? Are those individuals able to reestablish power, or are the Iranian people able to oust them? If the Iranian people are able to oust them, and then thereafter, if the Iranian people are actually able to make something good of their own future, unlike what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, where the Afghan people and the Iraqi people essentially failed to run their own country, and they fell into infighting. If Iranians are able to avoid all that, if Iran is able to transition to a stable, new, more representative society, then President Trump will be able to make a claim for the Peace Prize. If, however, the Iranian people fail, so it's far less to him, he's able to bring about the removal of people. He's not necessarily, and I would say this is not just true for Trump. I think this is true for any and all world leaders and any and all powerful countries. We can instigate change, but controlling the flow of the change is ultimately up to the people of that country themselves. And I think this also therefore answers your second question. That is, does Trump have a plan? Essentially, it is not possible to be able to have a plan, because to have a plan means that then you have a leader lined up. So let us say, as what happened with Venezuela, where Maduro was removed, but Delcy was put in place, Delcy Rodriguez to move her into place. That really didn't change the regime much. The question here is, and we can talk about this as we go on today, who are the possible future leaders of Iran? And And can Iran use this as an opportunity to transit into a better future? Because let me just add one final thing right here. That is, right now, the remnants of the Ayatollah's regime are attacking all their neighbors. They're claiming they're doing so because there are US bases there. However, essentially in so doing, they're alienating all their neighbors. And so there's a lot of repair that Iran will have to do with the entire neighborhood.
Well, let's just say, let me send a reminder or let me send a message to President Trump. We don't know if President Trump is ever going to watch this interview, but just in addition to the people within your circle, and Professor Choksy and I, we also discussed the possibility of the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to you, end quote. Well, Professor Choksy, let's talk about another side of the voice. On the social media, former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, that she posted a super long message regarding what happened between Iran and the US. Now, the message started by saying that during the campaign, or of the presidential campaign, President Trump promised and vowed no more foreign wars and no more regime change. And the message went on by saying that domestically, American people are actually suffering. We're looking at this economic situation, the healthcare, immigration policy, and the whole list went on and on and on. And then she ended the long post by saying that, does war with Iran do anything to help American families stay together and survive? No, not at all, end quote. Professor Choksy, from your perspective, you're a political scientist, you're the expert. How do you assess such rhetoric from the different voice, I would say not within the party, but again, someone who used to stand side by side with President Trump? Do you think that by having the war or by taking such action, it's going to, I would say, I want to be careful not to change the game of the Republican Party, but they seem to create a new type of political norm within the political party. Your thoughts?
I think the number one lesson to learn from all this is that if you're running for political office, do not make too many promises. Because when you end up in office, the situation changes and you begin to realize that the promises you made may no longer be viable. So it was very easy to make a promise saying, oh, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to play any role in all this. On the other hand, as we looked at the lead up to what happened in the last couple of days, what we do know is that this was not simply Trump's pro-war circle, as opposed to those who didn't want the war, nor was it Bibi Netanyahu. It was also Saudi Arabia. What we are hearing is that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia had many communications with President Trump, saying that this was the time to essentially defang the Islamic Republic of Iran and help transition Iran to a more secular state. And so what we can see is that there was a consensus building behind the scenes in the region that the theocratic regime in Iran, the Islamic Republic, not the Iranian people, had become a liability for the region. The constant threats to close the Gulf of Hormuz, the constant threats against all these countries, it had reached a point where this was becoming untenable. And so I think what happened is that President Trump attempted the negotiations. And of course, people have different styles. President Trump's style is he does not have, shall we say, a great deal of patience for long, drawn-out negotiations. He made it very clear he expected a quick deal on the nuclear and missile issues, and if that was reached, he was willing to live with the Islamic Republic. In other words, cut the threats to the region, to Israel, to the United States, etc., tone down the internal repression, he would live with the regime. When that didn't happen, the opportunity came and the United States took it. So I think we should see it in that light. Now, of course, this does run against the anti-interventionist strains within the Republican Party. And I think we're going to see, it'll be interesting to see how those play out in November in the midterm elections. That is going to be an interesting issue. However, American elections generally operate on domestic issues, not international issues. So, if this war becomes a long, drawn-out one, where the United States is bombing Iran, not just for a couple of weeks, but for months sometime, that the United States and the region starts taking larger casualties, then it could impact the elections. If it is that the top aspects of the leadership are removed and we just sort of return to almost a status quo, it may not impact the elections.
Professor Choksy, let's talk about another critical piece of facts. According to opinion piece of the Washington Post, the columnist or the writer believe there's no reason to believe that the war with Iran is unnecessary. Again, one of the critical issue is Iran today still remains as a militarized regime. And we know that this is rather concerning. And also, as you mentioned before, there are so many neighboring countries are very concerned about the next move of Iran. For example, we talk about Saudi Arabia, we talk about Qatar and neighboring countries. But the question I guess everyone is asking at this moment is, why now? Why at this moment that we're seeing this military coalition between US and Israel at this moment? Is it just about this diplomatic relationship between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, or this is a strong message not only sent to the nation of Iran, but also can relate it to, say, North Korea or many other countries? So again, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, how do you assess Israel and US at this moment? And what about the neighboring countries? Should they be worried? Should they be concerned? And should they start to prepare something in order to avoid major disaster? Your thoughts?
I think that the neighboring countries, the countries of the Persian Gulf, were already prepared. I believe that as far as we can tell, they knew this was coming. As I mentioned, it appears that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was involved in the decision behind the scenes. And these countries, to some extent, realized that there would be casualties. Let us keep in mind, however, that by and large, the destruction has not been as extensive as one could have imagined. It is also very clear that Iran does not have the capability to hit hard targets. What we have seen is in places like Dubai, etc., they're hitting hotels. In other words, they're trying to create civilian chaos, which of course is going to further alienate the citizens of those countries from the Iranian regime. So I would argue that the Iranian counteroffensive is actually proving to be counterproductive to the Iranian regime, because the one thing that we have seen with the American and Israeli strikes this time around particularly is that they have gone after military targets, nuclear targets, but also regime targets. They have not attacked civilian facilities. The one instant of the school being hit, it appears from what we can tell that was actually a misfired IRGC Iranian rocket that took out the school rather than a US strike. I'm sure that will be clarified in time, and we'll know the truth. It could possibly that it was an accident on the part of the United States. But the United States and Israel have not been attacking regular civilian targets. And so, but the Iranians have responded by hitting civilian targets in the Gulf. And so I think the Iranian regime is continuing to make a series of miscalculations, further alienating its neighbors. And I think further pushing the leadership of those nations to work with Israel, to work with the United States in this case, to remove the Islamist regime. Now, whether that will be successful is another question, which I think we can talk about in a few minutes here.
Well, again, Professor Choksy, let's keep our conversation going. What's the next step for Iran? Because we know that today everyone is still very concerned. Okay, what's next? Because learning the history, again, I don't want to break it too long, but let's think about the Vietnam War. Let's think about the Korean War. Let's think about all the international conflicts that U.S. was involved. And recently that we look at the case in Venezuela. People ask the question, what now? What's the next? So again, you mentioned briefly, what are the options for Iran at this moment? The country cannot be systematically run without the head of the government. So who are the ideal takeover? Who are the people? And what can we expect, especially the reactions? And also, Professor Choksy, you know this better than I do. When we talk about the missiles, not the long-range missiles are threatening to the neighboring countries, actually are the short ones. The short ones are really concerning and also threatening. Again, let's go back to the question. What is the next step? What can we expect? And what about the military, the power? Your thoughts?
Right. So the next steps, what we know is happening inside Iran is that the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has been eliminated. Remember, Iran has an established bureaucratic branch, a legislative branch, an executive or presidential branch. The executive branch and the legislative branch are popularly elected. You had on top of that the theocratic branch headed by the supreme leader. The supreme leader has been removed. Most recently, after the last war, the elected president, Pezeshkian, had essentially been sidelined by the supreme leader, who had placed one of his chosen acolytes, Ali Larijani, a secular politician, but a politician coming from a long clerical lineage, in charge. And even Pezeshkian had to run things by Larijani before acting as the president. Now what has happened is we know that in the last few hours, Iran has established a government council with Pezeshkian as the head. He is ultimately the popularly elected president of Iran. He is a secular politician. He used to be a physician before that. And so he, the head of the judiciary and the foreign ministry are involved. So the question remains now is, will those individuals be able to reach a compromise with the United States and work with the United States to bring about a transition towards a more secular and less regionally threatening Iran? Or are they also going to be boxed in by the fact that they were linked to the Ayatollah? And therefore, are they going to try to continue a repressive regime? Now, so that's one aspect. The other aspect is what's happening with the people. The people are celebrating the removal of the Ayatollah. The question remains as whether the people will be satisfied with the changes the government makes. So far, we're not seeing the Basij and the IRGC taking to the streets to try to repress the people. Will those hardline elements back off? And will the people be able to bring about a change? That's also an unknown. There are also the external actors, particularly Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah. He wants to return, and he says he wants to be a constitutional monarch. That factor is also unknown. So I think there are many unknowns at this point. But I think it all ultimately is going to come down to the will of the Iranian people. And what I will suggest here, the most important aspect, is I do not see President Trump actually putting U.S. boots on the ground. He may do sort of a strike to extract someone like he did with Maduro. That's different. But the United States is not going to go in large scale. Trump's not going to do that. So it's going to be up to the Iranian people. And this is where I think we need to look at Afghanistan and Iraq and hope that the Iranian people prove, shall I say, to be more collectively wiser, to put aside their individual or group interests and work towards a national interest, because this is the time. The theocratic regime is weak. It has been hammered. It has been, large parts of it have been decapitated. This is the time the Iranian people can indeed bring about a transition to a more secular representative government. It's going to be up to them. And there's nothing that Trump or the United States or Israel or even any of the neighboring countries or even any of the other global superpowers can do.
Professor Choksy, I want to ask you the last question for our conversation. Let's bring another country into our conversation, which is China. We know that today, again, this trade relationship between China and Iran is so critical. Especially, again, President Trump has addressed the function, or we say the presence of Hormuz. I mean, again, this is a critical channel to build up this relationship in this in terms of trade, in terms of economic benefits. China, it's not going to be a bench player after what happened. And of course, China has been well known and built the reputation of not interfering in any international crisis. But that's not the reality we're living in right now. We're looking at what happened in Venezuela. We're looking at the war in Ukraine. And certainly people will have higher expectations from China regarding what's happening in the nation of Iran. So, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, how do you think that we should assess the China's reaction at this moment? And also, how do you think that this possibly can turn around or perhaps to make adjustment regarding the Iran-China relationship at this moment? Not North Korea, not Argentina, but China and Iran. Your final thoughts.
I think the critical aspect for China is China has become extremely dependent on cheap Iranian fuel to maintain its economy. And I think that is going to be the largest, if I were a policymaker in Beijing, that would be on my mind immediately. That is, how do we keep the energy flowing to maintain China's economy? And there are different possibilities. One, of course, is that that Saudi Arabia, the Saudis knew this was coming. So the Saudis have boosted production. The Saudi Arabia could help replace, of course, not at the same cheap cost, but at higher cost, but the Saudis could help replace the lack of supply coming from Iran. Certainly, the events in Iran, internally and externally, are going to disrupt Iranian supplies to China. It's a question of how does China tide over that disruption in the short term until things stabilize one way or the other in Iran, whether Iran returns to a hardline regime, whether there's change, etc. So there is going to be this period of uncertainty of where China and I will also add India get their two very large economic engines, get their energy from. And the possibilities, like I said, one certainly is for Saudi Arabia to pick up production, for the UAE to pick up production. And of course, what will be critical, and I think Trump will ensure that the Straits of Hormuz stay open. Despite all the threats, the Iranians in the last couple of days have not been able to close the straits. And I think I would say that's the one instance where I think you'll see cooperation between the United States, between China, between the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf and India, to make sure, and Pakistan, to make sure the straits stay open so that the other countries in the region can continue to ship energy eastwards to India, to China. And so I think there's an opportunity for these countries all to work together, not just to keep the Straits of Hormuz, but also to work together to help guide whatever new leadership emerges in Iran. Because I think that's the critical aspect. Iran has become, as we have discussed many times, a constant threat. It's sort of, we've been living with this endless threat, we're going to close this, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And I think President Trump, essentially his patience ran out against these threats. And it may not be the worst thing that there is short-term disruption, but the long-term, the Iranian people get a possibility, and the region, despite all the tensions and the fighting now, that the long-term, the level of threat decreases, and things go back to Iran being a more rational, stable regime representing the true values of its people, rather than the rhetoric and the belligerence of its leadership.
Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Jamsheed Choksy. Professor Choksy is a distinguished professor. He's the former chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, former chair of the Department of Central Eurasia Studies. He's the current director of the Inner Asia and Uralic National Resources Center at Indiana University at Bloomington. Well, Professor Choksy, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay a closer attention to the relationship between U.S. and Iran. And thank you so much for doing this.